First of all, maybe a few words. So, as you can see, I'm also with Robert Bosch GmbH. That's my main work employer, but I'm using the slide set of the Linux Foundation Europe. I'm advisory board member there and basically ended up there due to all the work in automotive, open source, embedded, which I did. And to give you a rough idea, what we will cover today is, first of all, open source in a commercial environment. Most likely all of you are somehow in a commercial environment and in open source. You know some challenges in there, but I always like to get a more general picture on this. And then also go over to consider like the usage of open source, and not directly on the mobility industry, but more like the things which you are operating in, which you need to take care of, and then go on with really the challenges and opportunities, what's going on, what do we see with a wider consortium, connectivity chances, China. And I may mix sometimes mobility and automotive because, well, Bosch was so huge in combustion engines that we just basically had the automotive world, but now we see, due to electrification, more things, more ecosystems grow together. So sometimes I will say mobility, sometimes automotive. Yeah, we basically also just move on to say mobility more often and no longer automotive, because we also see the stacks grow together. I am in this field of automotive since more than 15 years. Always with Bosch or subsidiaries of it, and like 12 years with open source. And what I found quite impressive recently, so I went to Brussels for FOSDEM, and before there were workshops from the European Commission, there were workshops from the Open Policy Summit, and then one number which you could see also there was like 65 to 95 billion euros are spent in the open source world, contributing to the GDP. And I put this out of this report, The Impact of Open Source Software. The link is below. The slides, I guess, will most likely be shared later, or also make them public. And it's like 200 pages of what all innovation means and technology, open source software as well as hardware, for Europe to come to digital autonomy and other fields. And I just thought the number is already enough to just tell. And yeah, why does it come that we have, like, we're building products and we have open source in? And there are typical elements. If you are a project manager, I was project manager for like 6 or 7 years, and I typically need to operate in 3 environments. So I had a time, a schedule which I had in, I had budget, and I need to deliver a certain amount of content. And these are limited resources. And so you typically can consider, what are my chances where I go in this triangle? How do I get a faster development? How can I reduce budget? How to do not develop all on your own? And then there is someone saying, you know, I found this thing in the internet. And that's maybe the start for open source, which leaves you just in this one way, because even if you say, well, I'm not convinced it's something new, what all risks are in there, let's go with it, just hire another 100 engineers, you will not find them, or just throw a whole lot of money in another company, you don't have the money, so you always end up in there and just may see open source is your way into faster development, cost savings, you get more flexibility because you can change things more easily, and something which hasn't been in touch on the first page, you also get really an outreach to experts with the community. But yeah, even if you don't want to make use on your own, you may also work with a consultancy. You don't use a vendor to provide software, so it's also a service idea which you have. And if you now think, how much part of my work is really relying and consuming open source, and I guess there's many, many components which you may use of. And if you then say, in a mobility environment or an automotive environment, to how much of this do I really contribute back? So where will I give back something to the community of the software, of the hardware which I consume? And typically the answer is mostly just a little bit limited number or nothing at all. And then the next thing would be, well, you built this product and you have competitors. and you consume open source, most likely your competitor will also consume open source. But how much do you know from your competitor which software components are in there? Especially if you're a very closed environment where you see a competitor. So most likely you will know nothing. And there's no, traditionally, no real collaboration. Nothing is in there. You don't know what the product of the other company looks like. And interesting enough, 20 years back, when I was not yet in Bosch, but my joint venture company where I worked in was founded. This was a joint venture created by Bosch and Denso. And it was really in 2003, where they said, well, we need to be more competitive. We need to build, and this time it was navigation and radio devices. And what they said, we are the two largest companies in the world, the biggest competitors, but we joined forces in a joint venture to create and concentrate on non-differentiating elements of the software stack and the hardware. And they started with building an ASIC because hardware was the most expensive part of it, and they saw they could have the most savings with it. And then they figured out the hardware needs software. So they moved on and added the software. They created a software group. They figured out that even the data format for navigation is not something which is differentiating because you need to have a standard format all around the world. So they were also bringing this together. And then we start in this joint venture ASIC environment, very closed, still already a bit open, right? This was the joint venture, was like the collaboration of the past. And interesting enough was, it started with an ASIC, but they saw that the ASIC costs are very high. And to lower the cost again, they said, let's make a standard product. So the next generation of hardware was in collaboration with a silicon vendor, which was selling this chip, which was created by Bosch and Denso, also to the open for a standard commercial product. And then in the next generation, it moved on and we said that doesn't make sense anymore to even spend this money. So we just bought a chip, a commercial off the shelf, and said we do not develop it anymore. It's too expensive. And during this transition, even between the first standard product and the commercial off the shelf, we figured out that why should we always take a commercial OS, develop all these drivers if there is a large ecosystem? And so in 2012 time or so, we brought our first Linux product into the field just for a cost-saving reason. And I guess this is one of the main drivers still in the mobility, to really look for where can I save cost, but not really taking all the risks in there or seeing the risks, because normally you end up with just saying, I want to be faster, I can use it, and it makes cheap because I save some royalties or something like this. But there are elements like that you are new to the market and you don't know about the licenses yet. There are, I would say, positive and negative license impacts which you can have. And what you also you go maybe to a silicon vendor and you get software provided by someone and you just take it and say, well, they deliver the software, it's for free, I can start developing something on it. But you may end up in a trap because this is just software to bring up something. It's not a quality software, it's nothing which you really considered for a long time. So this is the next step that you need to understand. I need to maintain something, and if we are in automotive or mobility, we will talk about 20 years plus maintenance. So we have product in the life cycle which need to be maintained 20 years. And if you look into civil infrastructure environments, you may end up with 30 years plus. Right? And if you don't see this, things get connected. I don't know if any one of you owns a connected washing machine, for example, which can be controlled by apps. Consider how long you use your washing machine. Personally, I guess I have my one since 15 years. It's not connected, definitely, but it's running smoothly for 15 years. And if I have a connected one, maybe in 15 years, I still want to see that the connectivity works and nobody hacks the washing machine to set up the temperature always to 90 degrees and shrinking all my clothes. Well, and also for a car, you may not change your car that often. There are people who change their cars every 2 years. Maybe you change your phone every 2 years, but typically, also here, I see many people running cars for 10, 15 years. Things may change here due to more a sharing environment, more for distributed autonomous driving gave you a new trend on this, so this may all change, but still there is a lot of equipment around there which is in use for many, many years, where you might not have full access, but things get connected. So this is something else which is a risk factor, which means consider what you take when you do open source. And the highest risk maybe is local modifications. Because if your car is not, or your device is not connected, if you don't do that much, but you have just plain things, then all may be good. But what will end up is you download something and it gives you just the 80% fit, 90% fit, but you will most likely modify something in there. And this can cause breaking changes. And I guess I have somewhere later also some examples. This is what happened to us with these kind of unconsidered dependencies. So I come back to this later, right? Yeah, one element to find out what you have in the system, and I need to mention it these days, so it's the SBOM. It's your ingredients of the product, and you need to understand really how things look like. And what I found interesting about this was, I was talking to the people from Osadl, like some years back, and they do a lot with small and middle-sized enterprises, and they said they really have consulted companies which brought in industrial Linux products into the market by just downloading the things, getting things to work and ship it. They never considered which kind of license they have in. They never did a check. They never published the code later on, which they had to publish from the GPL license perspective. So they were completely blank and never knew what's in there. So that's why I also put this specific part, and I believe it's good that we end up with the SBOM part to know what's in there, to figure out where are vulnerabilities. And here I also put the icon of the SPDX in there. There's also Cyclone DX as an alternative, but I guess currently the SPDX is moving fast, getting new elements in there. I'm also active in the ELISA project, which is for enabling Linux and safety applications. And this brought, for example, new elements for requirements management also into the SBOM, for design documents, SPDX for safety, because if we are thinking about a mobility industry where you do more autonomous assistance functions, you always get safety involved, and you have many suppliers in there. So that's what we have here. And yeah, another one about the license. So if you have a wrong license, this can also slow you down or may have a major impact on your community. So what you can see, if you have a very permissive license and you're not considering good community management, then you see that your product may not grow that much. So what I come from the past, I knew FreeRTOS. FreeRTOS is shipped by many SoC vendors also as an RTOS, and it doesn't bring any real obligations due to the very permissive license in there, but you hardly find a community. And it's growing, and I guess what you see from a community is just the tip of the iceberg, because so much is done in-house and just like kept locally. While if you take, for example, the Zephyr project, where it's really a lot of stress is put on community, put to the open, you can see there's growing contributed, there's growing committers, and so this is something where you can have the element. On the other side, you can say there's also very copyleft license, and if you are in mobility environment like VM, or I would say automotive, when we built infotainment system, we had hard pains to get rid of all the GPL v3 versions. And even if software changes over time and change the license, we need to see how we handle things. It's not that we don't want to open certain topics, but we have obligations. If you are working with strong partners like Google and Apple, and you need to have CarPlay and Android Auto in your car to sell this these days, you need to make sure that all the licenses are properly handled and that you're not unwheel any information. So therefore, handling the license is very important. And when we did this, we were quite young in the company. So therefore, I would say these days you need to master the technology in the companies. You see it with manufacturing, car manufacturers, which really try to do more responsibility on the system, on open source. And what we did in the beginning, we took open source consultancies. The first problem which we've challenged was the company which we had in. They haven't considered how much quality and effort it takes in mobility or automotive. So we always ruined and bankrupt the other company. It was bought by a larger one. This saved their neck, but they were basically not prepared, and we were not aware that we basically allocated 80% of the resources in the company. So we never asked how many engineers are there, and we figured out they were all bound to our project, and we had very strong automotive requirements on contracts, that this always messed it up. Over time, what we also had was that we were not fully aware, and we were, for example, using Yocto. And the Yocto was processing. We asked for a new feature. It was not in there in Yocto, and I really like to tell this story because I was responsible for an integration team building the product, and then I went and had a chance to talk to Richard Purdy as Yocto maintainer, and said, well, you know, we have these and these features which are really missing, and this does not work in our Yocto. And he said, well, this was solved 2 years back. How could this be? Well, yeah, then let me get back to the engineer. So I went back to my team and said, you know, I went to Richard Purdy and he told me this is solved since 2 years. I said, yes, of course it is. I said, you said we cannot do it. No, we cannot do it. So, okay, we cannot do it, but it's solved. Yeah, we are so much locked in because our consultancy did so many local modifications to all our requirements, which were never discussed with upstream, that we have no chance to upgrade our software stack anymore. And this was just one example where I said, okay, it's good to talk to the community. And just like last year, we had another consultancy was doing something for testing with us and also some other activities. And what was figuring out was they have a very nice QA tool for showing reports. And this is something which they, as an open source consultancy, also developed. It's open source, it's available, it's their tool. So on their agenda, naturally, they will also promote their solutions. I discussed in the ecosystem of our testing environment within Lava and figured out, oh, there's something which fits to Lava perfectly. And it's even maintained by Linaro and the community. Our consultancy never told us about it. It's basically because they had their tool, and of course it's the best. If it's not the best, they wouldn't have written it. So therefore, yeah, there are different motivations for going to open source. We talked about the consultancy. This can be something for you, and you can make money with it and good business. You need, and even if we experienced this in the past, we're still working very good with them, and we value the partnership. Another point which you can bring in there is that it's your enabling technology. If you say, I'm not making money with the software part of it, or with the software stack as such, but more with the services around it, it's also a good way of open sourcing it, because then you can share this and you say, well, we have an ecosystem, I provide this. I put the spoiler SBOM CRA, make sure that you have a plan for updatability and how you maintain all the things, because just making something open source because it's nicer open source will not help you. The last part is like where we started 20 years back with the joint venture of Bosch and Denso. There was basically no real monetary value of it. It's a commodity, and we will have more and more commodity in the stack. So you need to make sure you update things for 20 years. And you need to make sure that you know what vulnerabilities are in and you want to fix them. And this is much easier on a shared burn. And some risks here. So for example, we see that the Everest project runs in the Linux Foundation on the LF Energy, which is a very good step, because you may end up with some bad guys also. If you think about single vendor project like the HashiCorp part, here they were running Terraform, and then they changed from an open source license to a business source license, and this can really lock you in. And this is just one example. Elastic was doing in a similar way, and sometimes I can also, so don't say that this is, I call it bad guys, but it's not all bad guys, because they are also driven by something. There was recently an article on Heise which was talking about post-open source, because there are many, many companies which just take and don't give back. And this also drives companies like HashiCorp, like with the Elasticsearch case, that they say we need to change something, because we give this all for free, but these huge major companies all take it, but they never give back. And here on the other side, also from the bigger players, I experienced this in infotainment. So we came from a commercial OS, we went to Linux, building our navigation devices there. And well, Google did a very good job with their, which is with Android still kind of open source, but not really full open source. But they, for example, just said we are more interested in selling our Google automotive services, our data, want to collect this. We make money with this, so we need to see how we get this data, so we throw in Android into automotive. And this basically completely messed up my past world because I was doing a lot of Linux in the navigation domain. Now I'm doing it in other fields, but that's quite good. Yeah. I had spoilers, some SBOM CRA. I will also put one slide on this to understand these initiatives and regulation which coming from Brussels. You see that even around FOSDEM, I attended 2 days which was mainly driven by policies, and even the European Commission did some work on open source there. This is really where software gets regulated. And if you have a lot of regulation in there, if you have requirements, all these things is something which everybody has to do. And by this may also give you a lot of burden on things that you really need to see, where can I make money with? What is my selling point? And where do I better create open standards, collaborate? How do I do this? And also within the CRA, we see the higher responsible for open source stewardship, which basically is the role of foundations, which will take up certain things, but they also require membership, they require budget to really be able to do so. Otherwise, they will also be on risk, right? So therefore, the foundations are really a good point to collaborate. Also open source projects. If you just have an open source project and you try to collect partners, it's also not that easy always. So Bosch has an own Linux, currently we call it constructions kit, distribution, whatever, together with Collabra as a major open source supplier, and we have this as an independent project, and we are also looking for partnership, but you can really see that people hesitate to jump in because we were looking also in the field of competitors, but then things like antitrust pop up and so on, and by this it's much better to go into an environment where you have a foundation like Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, Apache Foundation, Python Foundation, the name is long. And by this you can just check what fits to you. I put some examples here. Currently for mobility, the SDV alliances are growing, and there were Sophie and Eclipse SDV, and they actually joined forces because they were in a very similar field and go into the SDV alliance together with AutoSAR, with Cuvisa, where Cuvisa is in the way of creating open standards. So they more look into how can we have interoperability, how can we share the efforts, how do we put synergies on this. And here, also to mention, for example, for AGL and I put here in GNV, which was before Cuvisa was there, so it was a generic IVI infotainment system, and AGL basically does also infotainment systems. But these were two competitive, more or less, project initiatives, foundations, however you want to call this, and they were competing in an environment where Google made it into the game. And they were discussing on a lot of topics in the initial phase, like which audio manager is better, which thing is better. All is open source, all of the components, but they were also forming more Western and the Eastern world side, and it was not all going hand in hand. And well, it ended in there that Genevieve is now Cuvisa, and they more look in signal specification. They saw there is no field for infotainment anymore because they were just overrun by a new open standard, which was created with Android. Right, so these are the parts in there, and this is really interesting. And also to observe this, for example, with ELISA, which is like here, a lot of the major players are in this initiatives, but to really get them in is quite hard. And I want to bring up an example which I hear in the ELISA project. So that's my one with enabling Linux and safety applications, where I'm currently technical steering committee chair. And when I had it early 2020, I was in a workshop. And in there, they were asking, like, when will you have a solution? I said, well, if we see where we are now, I guess it will take us 3 to 5 years until we are really settled, because safety always is a little bit slower due to the many things we have to consider to the formal parts. And then they said, okay, then we come back in 3 years. So yeah, but you know, when you come back in 3 years, I will tell you can come back in 3 to 5 years. And I get these questions typically and quite often whenever I give a talk. They're very interested, many people, and then they ask, may I ask when you will be done? And my question these days is, well, if you contribute, it's just getting faster. Because I cannot make any commitment as long as we have people standing around and not doing anything about it. And the question to do something, and now we go more on this touching point towards automotive mobility industry, we see a lot of changes, and the traditional role which we had there was that we built the full burger of a product, right? We were responsible for basically anything. We saw the shift with the hardware where we don't build our hardware anymore, but things just move on. And we have now many people contributing to the software stack. We're seeing more responsibility. We see that former decentralized elements get centralized into a smaller stack and into more powerful hardware. And by this suddenly we have a full set of all suppliers, contributors, customers in many different fields. And we are again at this environment of open standards, collaboration, interfaces, exchanges, software bill of materials, and all comes together just from the nature that our product's getting more complex, while the car as such, for example, gets much less complex, right? We reduce a lot of components, but the complexity is going more and more into software-driven business. And here it's really to manage master complexity, increase quality, bring things together, and this can be done with open source. I remember an engineer who told me, he said, oh yeah, open source brings lower quality than if we write code internally. This is something which you may face quite often. And if you then go to the engineer and say, okay, can we contribute your code open source? No. Why can't we contribute your source code? Well, it's not good enough. So you say it's not good enough for what? No, we cannot put it upstream. So, but it's good enough to bring it into a Bosch product, but it's not good enough to bring it upstream. So this is something which I experienced here and there. So it's a really strong concern that people are convinced if they're in a closed environment and may hesitate to go into the open. But why? Because there are pull requests, there is feedback, there's direct feedback, and the people who are giving feedback are not paid by you, so they are not saying what you want to hear. And still, as we are at the beginning, there is no way around it. And why is this? Because we are not responsible anymore, and we cannot be responsible. The OEM has major responsibility to bring things into the product, into the market, but we have so many parties involved, and elements here is a connected ecosystem. The cars get connected, we have electrification, we have more things which need to fit together. There's a charging infrastructure, for example, right? Currently you may end up with 5 to 10 different cards for having different charging stations. This will not happen. We will see a consolidation to major solutions and then have major elements because, well, we have Android and we have basically the iPhone, whereas all the Symbian phones gone, right? There's this consolidation, and this happens currently in the traditional mobility or automotive environment, and I guess we have still a phase where for electric vehicles and infrastructure, all the environment around, a lot of room is there. We saw the technology S-curve in there. We are in an uplift, but there is always following a mark of consolidation, and therefore it's good to find coalition to create standards and bring things together. Right. And I guess to give back later a little bit of time, I want to stress that we had a very NDA-driven. I think I spent already a few words on this. I mentioned the Geneva AGL versus Android topic. The SDV enables new ways, but also here you need to see, is there single vendor projects? Is there something where just one company provides input? And if it's interesting for you, this can mean it's your time to jump in. And what I heard, I think it's quite true, it even works for other environments. If you think about communities, a community is healthy and can move forward when it survives 3 to 5 years and even survive if the main sponsor jumps out of it. So as long as it's only driven by one company, you always rely on this company. And we have good examples on the past where something like a transition can also work, where you just reinvent yourself with the Cuvisi from Geneva part. And here you also need to see this. So in Europe we have, like the Linux Foundation Europe, we have other initiatives, but we also have strong competitors outside of Europe. So where you can say if we have digital autonomy interests, where we want to just see that we can handle the complexity of products and be not completely dependent on somewhere else, it's good to consider what can we collaborate on and is thing really something which is differentiating. And for this, I want to bring in an example of China also, because China is just getting more and more attention also for battery electric vehicles. It's just where things are currently happening, and this is very interesting because they see we may have sanctions, we may have regulations coming up, and we cannot rely on the complete Western world and China. So what they say is, if we use open source, it's domestic, it's seen as local software because they have a full control on this. And there are more and more SoCs, chips coming from China, which may not run like if we have QNX as the major microprocessor safety operating system, they may not have support for it, but still they need to serve the product. So this gives, on the one hand, a good market opportunity, but it also shows that they are operating already in a very innovative environment and bring this innovation to Europe. And they're really asking explicitly for open source because they know we may end up in a more geopolitical world where not everything will be available all the time. And with open source, you have a foundation to do your local work on this, to form a local community around this. And that things are closer. I saw yesterday. So I took this picture on my way in Frankfurt that BYD is just promoting their car. And the funny part, I put this below, so you can still see here it says, Homologation noch ausstehen, which means they also advertise the car already before it's actually done. They already now make promises to sell a car. And consider the European or German attitude, will you sell so much before you have done the things? In a more market, most likely not. If the company is aware that they need to maintain a lot of software 20 years, or what happens over time, we will not see. And I found this quite interesting. I checked back because I put out my iPhone and made a picture of it, and then I don't know how this came, but I also sort of, well, see, this is a phone which already has a good software support still. It's a lot of proprietary things in there. But I was just wondering, when was then the first iPhone there? And this was actually in 2007. And we still get security updates for iPhone 6 here and then. But just for very critical issues, we'll still have updates for iPhone 8. But nobody thinks about the iPhone 2G for having still security updates in. And this is not 17, it's 17 years. It's not at all 20. And to have really in mind, how can I make a robust software that I survive this disruptive field and this environment? And for completion, I put some more parts. Electrification, we already know. This is in there. We have the cloud connectivity I mentioned. App stores is something to consider from an ecosystem. And I missed to say this on the China part, but there was a small icon on the Open Mobile Hub. This is actually to form an ecosystem on app development where you can simply develop your app and you don't need to care about what it's for Android, what Android is below. And therefore, so where is the case in this? But of course, not every market has access to Google services. And the Google services are very tightly bound to the user experience. Imagine you would open the app, and all the time you open the app, you need to log in, or it says to you the service is not available. No, I cannot open the app because you don't have the Google services enabled. They are working on this, and this is also something coming from China. And if you judge this as a disruptive field, it could mean if they really form a large ecosystem and found a good foundation on an open mobile hub, this can cause really issues for Google, because that's how they make business, and if they are, as they bind you to the services. But no, if an open standards come, this can disrupt and this can have impact. So this is something which really gets to considered. And I didn't touch about AI yet that much. This is, of course, everybody talks about these days. We need to see where it goes, but already ChatGPT helped me a little bit on structuring the presentation. So I just asked, what do I definitely have to say and what shouldn't I miss? And half of it was rubbish, but there were also some good considerations. So okay, yeah, that's very nice. And Marco also mentioned sustainability, so that's in there. I end up with the presentation with a little bit of shout out for community work. So you cannot afford not to use open source. You need to use SBOM to understand your ingredients, and this will be regulated. As you have connected devices, they get exposed. There are more and more ideas on how to hack systems and how to make own firmwares on it, so you make sure that you are capable of handling updates. You cannot close everything because your ecosystem is simply too huge, and you work with many parties. And you need to do this in an environment. You need to have a form of exchange, so standards are getting important. And yes, there are a lot of ISO standards, but they are not open. And you can work for years on a new ISO standard, but in these years, some major player really puts effort in going into a market that can create a de facto standard with an open standard. And therefore, it should also be always considered, where is your value in it, right? And we find a lot of new spots because there is a disruptive market, so you can find, where is my spot, where do I spend effort? It could even mean I see so much base efforts, commodities in there, so I provide services around the commodity because still someone needs to do the work. And companies may not be willing to spend the engineers, but rather pay money for someone to do this work, right? And therefore, I guess it ends up in upstream maintenance is really becoming a corporate responsibility. It's going to the wider market. And if we are actors who really rely on open source in an environment and we build components on it, we need to see that we take our responsibility for it. That's the main thread of it. Thanks.